Well, if you have your Bible, go ahead and go to Acts chapter 8. We are in the middle of a series called Family on Mission, and we've titled this series Family on Mission because that's our vision for 2026 as a church, to really reclaim and reimagine what it means to be a family on mission. And so we're walking through the book of Acts, which was written by a man named Luke, and he documented the early startup days of those first followers of Jesus as they were going from this amazing news that Jesus had risen from the dead to becoming this movement that would turn the world upside down. In fact, if you're here and you say, I'm a follower of Jesus, you are a part of the story of Acts. You are part of the story on the other side of the resurrection. And in those early days, those first followers of Jesus, they were messy and they were imperfect, but they did something really, really well, and that is that they were not only committed to God, they were committed to one another. That they didn't live as a program, they didn't see the church as a place, they saw the church as a people, a community, a family. They saw one another as brothers and sisters, and God as the father of this family. And that family changed the world, is changing the world still, and I believe will continue to change the world. And so we're asking the question, what does it look like here in San Francisco to jump into that story and continue that story and be a family on mission? And so we're going to be looking at Acts chapter 8. I'll meet you there in just a couple minutes, but as I was preparing for today's teaching, I kept thinking about a guy in my life, an important figure in my life. His name was Daryl Couch. And Daryl was such a nice guy. He wasn't the kind of guy I would normally hang out with, though, if I'm honest. And yet he would become a really good friend of mine unexpectedly, someone that would play a pivotal role in my life and in my faith. For those who don't know, I wasn't raised in the church. And one of my first experiences in a church was my dad. He was visiting me on my 16th birthday, and at that point in my life, I'd already started to get into drugs and alcohol and started pretty young in that. My dad, I think, seeing that there was a problem there, didn't know what to do, and so he's like, I think I'll just drop him off at a church on his birthday. Weird 16th birthday gift, but it ended up being really transformative. Because in the church, long story short, I found a family in the church that I didn't have in my home, and I'll always be really grateful for that. But it didn't start out beautifully. When I was dropped off at the church, as you can imagine, I was a bit confused why I was here. Why did my dad think I needed to go here? I did not want to be here, but here I was. And so I sat in the back row, and if you've ever been a part of a youth group before, you probably know there was always that one teenager sitting in the back row, slouched down in the chair like this, the entire message, just like sending every signal that he or she does not want to be there. I was that student. I was sitting in the back and just ignoring the message, just sort of honestly in my head, not taking anything around me very seriously, counting down the seconds when I could leave. And finally, the service ended, and the saving grace of my experience was that they had they had a basketball court, and I've always loved basketball. And so I just went there because I was like, this is a great way to not talk to anybody. I'll just go play basketball. And I started playing, and then this guy named Daryl came up to me, really ruined my alone time, and started talking to me. And he asked me my name, and I was giving him the shortest answers possible. Does anybody do that when you're just like trying to end the conversation and move on? I was giving him the shortest possible answers, just trying to send him every signal that I was not really wanting to talk because I really was not planning on ever returning here. So we don't need to like do the friendship thing. But Daryl was stubborn, man. I don't know if he just didn't pick up on my signals. I think I was sending them pretty clearly, but he just kept talking to me, kept being interested in me, kept befriending me. And I would act like I didn't want it. I would act like I was not interested in it. But I think deep in my heart, I really was. I think like deep in my heart, I really did want to be seen. You know, a lot of the times this hard exterior that many of us put up, it's just a front, isn't it? It's an act, and it was for me. And Daryl, he just kept being interested in me. And what was so interesting is that he just asked questions. He didn't lead with statements. He didn't show up to the basketball court and say, do you know Jesus as your Lord and Savior? Like, he just was like, who's your favorite team? Can we play? What do you like doing on the weekends? What's your hobbies? He just seemed interested in me, which was rare because it felt like everyone else was trying to be interesting and this guy was just interested. And what it did in me is it began to shift some things in my heart and in my life where I decided, maybe I'll come back. Maybe I'll come back the next week. And you know what I did? And I came back the week after that and the week after that. And it took me a long time because I'm pretty stubborn to eventually follow Jesus. But eventually that wall came down. My life was transformed by the good news of Jesus. And I can honestly say, I'm not sure I would have ever come back. Not even sure if I would be a follower of Jesus today, which means I'm not even sure I would be a pastor today, had Daryl not had the courage to just meet me where I was on that basketball court, extend a whole lot of grace to this kind of cynical, jaded teenager, and just ask questions instead of leading with statements. Daryl probably had no idea the impact he was going to make in my life. In fact, I don't think he had any idea. I think he was just available. And he wasn't weird. He was interested in me. And it changed my life. I want to talk about what it means for us to do the same for like our coworkers, for our neighbors, for the barista at the coffee shop that you always see every time you go there. I go to Q. Anybody been to Q Specialty Coffee lately? Sarah's like the mayor of Q. Do you have Q in your hand right now? Okay. It's a really good coffee shop, but I go there often. The guy knows my name and order now. I love it, but today I want to talk about, like, as you build those relationships in San Francisco, how can you show up as a follower of Jesus, embody this good news that has transformed your life in such a way that it might just impact the life of another? I don't know what to call this message, but I've titled it so far, How to Be a Christian Without Being Weird. How does that sound? That's what I want to talk about today. Like, how do you show up with this good news of Jesus, which we should not be ashamed of or afraid of? This is good news. And we are in a time in the human story right now where the data is actually telling us people are more receptive to the news of Jesus more than a long time. And I'm not ready to throw out the like revival word out there, but I am saying there's a re-engagement. And I'm wondering what it would look like for us as followers of Jesus, living on mission, to go into our world with the good news of Jesus in our heart, and being willing to show up to people who are longing for hope and truth, hoping for identity, hoping for peace in a world that feels like it's anything but peaceful. How can we go as followers of Jesus and share that Jesus with them in such a way that it's appealing as opposed to distracting? How can we be a Christian without being weird? Let's talk about that today. I recently came upon a book written by a Jewish philosopher. This book was written about 100 years ago by a man named Martin Buber. He wrote a short, brilliant little book that I think diagnoses something that most of us don't even know is wrong with us. And this book is called I and Thou. And his whole argument in his book, I and Thou, is that there are only two ways to encounter another human being. He said there's two ways to encounter another human being. The first way that we encounter another human being is what he called the I-it way. The I-it way to encounter another human being. And when you encounter another human with the I-it posture, it is when you treat that other person like an object. They're not a who, they're an it. They are a means to your end. They only exist to serve a particular function that you have at that current point in time. The barista, not a person, they're just there to make the coffee. The Uber driver, not a person, they're just there to get you to the destination. The coworker, not really a person, they're just there to get you the information you need to move the project along. So in the I-it posture, you don't really look at people as people, you look at people as a means to your end. And he says you can do this with even people closest to you. You can have an I-it relationship with your spouse. You can have an I-it relationship with your kids. You can even have an I-it relationship with your best friend. You can have an I-it relationship with people in the church. In fact, I think if we're honest, if we're all not careful, all of us at times can slip into the I-it posture. That we look at people as simply a way to get what we are needing. And when they stop giving us what we need, then we move on. But he proposes another better way to engage with another human being, and he calls it the I-thou posture, the I-thou posture. In this posture, something shifts. You actually stop, you actually see and hear and know the person that you're talking to, and when you look at that person, you do not see them as simply a prop in your story, but you actually see them as a full human being in their own story that God values just as much as he values yours. And when you engage with people with this sort of I-thou posture, they feel seen, they feel heard, they feel loved, they sense that you are present with them when they're talking to you. They don't see you distracted, they don't see you thinking about your response before they're even finished with their sentence. Like you're actually in it with them, and they experience something deep and real in the relationship. Now, here's what's, I think, kind of interesting. Boubert believed that every I-thou moment, every time you approach and encounter a person with the posture of I-thou, he actually says this is a divine moment because he calls God the eternal thou. That God is the eternal thou. That God doesn't look at you or me as simply a means to his end, that he sees you, he hears you, he knows you, he loves you, not for who you maybe should be, but who you actually are, even in that moment. Like this God is forever present with you. That's what we celebrate every Christmas, right? Not a God who stayed at a distance, but a God who entered into the human story and is with us as humans. He is the eternal thou. So Boubert suggests that when we treat people with the I-thou posture, that moment is more than just us practicing emotional intelligence, which it is, but it's actually something deeper and richer, that it is actually holy ground. I mean, maybe you've had that moment, right? Maybe somebody who you're sharing your heart, you're sharing your life to them, and you can actually tell they're listening. They're not distracted, looking around. They don't look at their phone. They're just fully present with you in that moment. That person who isn't trying to tell you all the ways necessarily that you're wrong, but they're just hearing your story, standing with you in whatever chapter you're in. Those moments, they feel deeper than just a good connection. They feel holy almost. And so today I want to invite us into an I-thou posture in our relationships. And it sort of changes how we think about purpose when we live this way. Because when we talk about purpose, and this is the question that all of us, whether you believe in God today or not, like all of us want to have a life of purpose. You may not know this, the second best-selling book in the history of books next to the Bible is The Purpose-Driven Life. Like everybody wants to know, what is my purpose? What am I here for? And there's nothing wrong necessarily with that question. I'm just going to propose the question, what am I here for, is maybe a good question. It's just not the great one. In fact, I think Jesus is asking us to, as followers of Jesus, to ask a better question. What is that better question? It's not what am I here for? It's who am I here for? Who am I here for? And when you live your life with the posture of I, thou, you wake up every day, and instead of asking, what am I here for? You ask, I wonder who I'm going to be here for today. When you think about the work that you're doing, you're not thinking about the profit and the promotions. You're thinking about, I wonder what good I can do in the world and in the lives of others through this work. Like, who am I here for? I wonder what would change about how you live your day, how you show up to the office, how you show up to the coffee shop, or when you're on the Muni, if that question was humming in the back of your mind, who am I here for? See, I think if we're going to live the I, thou posture, if we're going to be that Christian in a world looking for hope and peace and love, then we've got to wake up every day saying, God, who am I here for? And how can I show up in a way that creates holy ground in every conversation and every interaction that I have? Which really brings me to the big idea of today. And I think if we're going to live into this I, thou posture and we're going to show up as followers of Jesus in the world, we got to understand this big idea. It's this. Like, God is already on the move in the people around you. The only question is, will you move with him? Like God is already pursuing every single person in your life that is around you. The question is, will you move with God and participate with what God is already doing? And you may be here and you're like, well, how do you really know God is pursuing all people? How do you know that God is always moving towards all people? Because that is the story we celebrate, the good news. Right? The gospel is not a story about humans moving towards God. It's about a story about a God moving towards humans. It's about a God who pursues humans with this sort of reckless and scandalous grace and unconditional love. That's the story we believe, so we can assume at all times, to all people, there is not one person God is not pursuing. There is not one person in your office that God does not know by name and is not pursuing with a reckless love. God is on the move at all times. The question is, will you join him? And how in the world do we do that in a way that's helpful in San Francisco in 2026, wherever you might work or play? And that's where I want to go to Acts chapter 8. Because Acts chapter 8 is this really story about a man named Philip And he gives us a master class on what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus without being weird. He really shows us simply what we can do as soon as today we leave this building, how we can show up in our world in a way that joins where God is already moving. So a little bit of context on Acts chapter 8. For those who don't know, last week we talked about how the church was entering sort of this new chapter in its story. For the first 6 chapters of Acts, you sort of see the church experiencing, it just seems like they're on the mountaintop, right? Everything's going well. Jesus is risen from the dead. They're gathered, they're praying, they're worshiping. It just seems like, man, nothing is going to stop the church. But then in chapter 7 and in chapter 8, you begin to see the church's story take a turn towards the worst, it seems, at least. In that you have a man named Saul who's going from house to house and he's imprisoning followers of Jesus. Saul actually gives the green light to Stephen to be killed. He's the first martyr of the early church. And now this church that was gathered is scattered. And they're going beyond Jerusalem and beyond Judea. And they even find themselves in Samaria, which I talked about last week. The last place any of these Jewish people would have thought God would move, and then God moves, because that's just what God does. Like, be careful who you write off. Be careful who you count out, because God's always counting them in. And Samaria is this beautiful picture of God moving, and there's miracles, and there's thousands of people deciding to become followers of Jesus. And then you have this guy named Philip. And Philip's really interesting, because Philip is not one of the famous 12 disciples. He's actually more of a deacon. He's a servant leader in the early church. But Acts, for some reason, keeps tracking this guy. And my guess is because Philip seemed to live in a way that maybe most of us don't live. In Acts chapter 8, revival is breaking out in Samaria. Like I said, thousands of people deciding to follow Jesus. And you could imagine, at least if it were me, like if I'm in the middle of a victorious moment, if I'm in the middle of a season of momentum, the last thing I want to do is leave that, right? The last thing I would want to do is remove myself from that. And yet that's precisely what an angel who shows up to Philip invites Philip to do. To leave where the action is, to leave the momentum, and to follow him into an unknown place. In Acts chapter 8, verse 26, it says this: "Now an angel of the Lord said to Philip, 'Go south to the road, the desert road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza.'" The desert road. The angel says, go away from the crowd. Go away from the miracles. Leave the momentum. I know that God is moving here in Samaria, but he's also moving somewhere else that you might not fully expect. You know, Philip had every reason to push back. Like, what are you talking about, angel? You know, like, this is where you're moving. Why would I want to remove myself from this situation? This is so good. I want to soak up every single second of it. But Philip doesn't do that. He doesn't push back. He doesn't talk back. Instead, what we're told in Acts 8:27, it says, so he started out. So he started out. It might be the most overlooked, I think, verse in Acts chapter 8. Because here's what it tells me about Philip, and I think what it tells us about what it looks like to follow God, and that is that obedience, most of the time, if not all the time, will come before clarity. That obedience will come before clarity. The angel didn't say, hey, I'm about to do this really powerful thing in the desert on the road away from everything over here. Just trust me, it's going to be awesome. He just says, no, just go to the desert road. Go down this place to this place that you weren't expecting to go, a place where it doesn't appear to be any momentum or any miracles or anything. Like just go. And Philip, he does what many of us don't do. He actually just did it. Without clarity, without understanding the full plan. And I've noticed in my life, and I bet if you've been following Jesus, you notice this as well, that when God invites you into something, he rarely hands you a map. God has yet to ever drop me a map and show me every step of the process of where he's inviting me into. He doesn't give you a map. He just invites you to take the next step. And that next step is what Philip was willing to take. And as a result of that, he was able to participate with what God was doing without him even knowing it. And so if you want to move where God is moving, the first thing I want to maybe take note of Acts chapter 8. If you want to show up as a Christian in San Francisco without being weird, here's the first thing. I want you to write down this, that available beats able. That if you want to move where God is moving, understand that available beats able. Availability beats ability. I think what's so interesting about Daryl in my life, like I said earlier, he's not like necessarily the guy I would have hung out with. He wasn't the coolest guy at the youth group, to be like totally frank. He a little socially awkward. He wasn't a pastor. He wasn't a theologian. He didn't have all the answers. He was just a guy who in that moment in time was available. He was just willing to create margin in his day, margin in that evening to make room for me. And availability, I actually think, is a spiritual discipline. It's just not one we talk about all that much. I think we talk about the spiritual discipline of prayer, the spiritual discipline of reading the scriptures, the spiritual discipline of generosity, of community, all good spiritual disciplines, by the way, all important. But we almost never really talk about like the spiritual discipline, and it is a discipline, especially in our world and in this city, the discipline of availability. What do I mean by availability? The willingness to be interrupted. Because if you're here and you're like, well, I'm totally down to be available, I just don't want to be interrupted, then you're probably not as available as you think you are. You see, I think availability and interruptibility go hand in hand, the willingness to be redirected and rerouted. I think the reason we struggle with the spiritual discipline in particular, at least the reason I know why I struggle with availability and interruptibility, is that availability costs control, doesn't it? Like living a truly available and interruptible life, it requires you to sort of open up your hands and give up control and give up your calendar and give up some of your preferences and just say, God, if you want to interrupt my life, if you want to do something that I'm not seeing, then God, I just give you the control and permission to do that. And that's really hard because some of you have worked really, really hard to make your life interruption-proof. Right? There's not a lack of content, social media influencers telling you basically how to time block your day, how to master every moment of your life, how to manage your life so that no one can interrupt or get in the way of what it is that you want to do and where it is that you are going. And don't get me wrong, I have no issue with time blocking. I have no issue with people who manage their schedules. I think there's a time and place for that. But I think for some of us, if we're not careful, you can go so far that there's no margin for God to do anything that we didn't already approve. Like if we're not careful, we might just miss the holy moments that are around us all the time. There's this story in the Hebrew scriptures of a man named Jacob where he encounters God in this really life-changing and powerful way, and then he wakes up from this dream and he goes, God was here the whole time, I didn't know it. I wonder if some of us were to slow down and open up our lives and allow there to be some interruptibility and availability, what we might discover was already there all along. We were just missing it. Because we live in a culture that is obsessed with hustling. Go 100 miles an hour, 7 days a week. But what I've learned about love is love moves really slow. Love moves really slow. And so if you're going to be a part of what God is doing around you, which, by the way, God is all about loving people around you, it's going to require, at times, moving at the speed of love, which is always, always much slower than the speed of hustle. So let me ask you, how interruptible is your life right now? Like, you don't need to say it out loud, but like, be honest. Like, if scale it from 1 to 10, 10 being like anyone can interrupt you, to 1, you just have no margin for that. Like, where do you really land? How interruptible is your life? And if you don't know, let me ask you this. When was the last time you let your day get hijacked by a person who is in need and you weren't mad about it? Like, when was the last time you're like, man, I had this plan, but like this person came, interrupted everything that I had in store, and you know what? I'm not even mad about it. See, if we're going to come back to this big idea that God is already moving around you, and it's our job just to join what God is already doing, the first thing that we've got to do if we're going to show up in San Francisco and be followers of Jesus without being weird is just being available. Just opening up our lives enough and moving at the speed of love enough to see the holy moments that are always all around us. The second thing is this. If you want to move with God, the second thing is you got to know He's already there before you show up. And if you want to join what God is already doing, you just got to acknowledge God is already ahead of you. He's not improvising it. He's not winging it. He's well ahead of you. He's not catching up to you. And this is actually reassuring, I think, because sometimes I think the fear that we have is that we're not going to say the right thing, right? Or we're not going to know the right answer. And so we're like, well, I'm going to keep my faith down low. We're going to keep it quiet because I don't want to expose myself too much because what if they actually do or say something or need something and I just don't know how to respond? Can I just remind you, you don't have to be God. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to know everything that you're going to do ahead of time because God already does. He's already there. He's just inviting you to take the next step and join him. And the point here is really the big idea hidden right inside the story. Philip gets to the desert road, and sure enough, we're told there's a man on the desert road. And this man is an Ethiopian, a high-ranking official, the treasurer of an entire kingdom under a queen named Candace. And he's wealthy, he's educated, he's powerful. And he had just been to Jerusalem to worship, and now he's on his way home. And he's sitting in a chariot, and he's reading the Jewish scriptures, what we call the Old Testament. And the story gets kind of wild from here. He's not just reading anything. He's actually reading Isaiah chapter 53, which is that last song we sang at the end of worship, really inspired from Isaiah 53. If you're not familiar with that passage, it's one of the most prophetic passages in the entire Old Testament about a suffering servant who would carry the sins of the world. Isaiah 53 is pointing us to a future where Jesus would give his life on the cross and rise again. And so this moment, it's not a coincidence. This is a setup. God was there already. He was directing their paths to collide at this single moment. And we see it in Acts 8, verse 29. It says, the Spirit told Philip, go to that chariot and stay near it. He doesn't say jump in there and give him a sermon. He doesn't say give him your PowerPoint presentation. He doesn't say present your arguments to him. He just says go and draw near. And this, I think this idea that we are to draw near to people first, I think that's I think it's something I wish we as followers of Jesus maybe would understand a little bit more, that we're not just called to be friendly to people who are not like Christ. We're actually called to be friends. And you can't be a friend if you're not even willing to get near them. Who is maybe God inviting you to draw near, to be close to, so that you can be there ready in the moment that their heart is ready to receive the good news of Jesus? And this changes how we think about, I think, the people in our lives. That coworker, your sister-in-law, that friend who just walked through a divorce, the barista that you see every day. Like, they're not blank slates waiting on you to deliver the perfect sermon. But God has actually already been working in their hearts, moving in their lives, trying to meet them in their longings and their losses and in the things that they Google when no one is watching. Like, they're trying to find hope in their life because God is already moving in them even without you being there. You're just there to join. I love what C.S. Lewis, before he became one of the most influential Christian voices of the 20th century, he called himself the most reluctant convert in all of England. And he said God was hunting him through philosophy, through beauty, through grief, long before any Christian ever sat down with him. That's how God works. He's always moving towards people. He never gives up on anybody. And when God invites us to draw near, we can take off this pressure that we put on ourselves to be God because they already got one that's pursuing them. And you just need to be near, be a friend, draw close. You don't create the moment, you join the moment. And maybe this means we need to stop praying, God, here's what I want you to do today. And we just need to wake up and instead of praying, God, here's what I want you to do today, we just say, God, what are you already doing today? And how can I join that? God, what are you already doing in my coworkers' lives? And how can I draw near to that? God, what are you already doing in my neighbor's life? And how can I draw near to that? It's a totally different posture. One that lets God be God and you be the participant in what God is already doing in the life of somebody else. How do we join where God is moving? Well, first, we've got to be available. Second, we got to understand God is already there before you were. He's been preparing the way. And third is if you want to move with God, you got to choose curiosity over certainty. Choose curiosity over certainty. Watch how Philip does this. He walks up to the chariot, and like I said, he doesn't open with a sermon. He doesn't hand the man a tract. He doesn't give him 3 reasons why Jesus is Lord. He asks a question. It says, Philip ran up to the chariot and heard the man reading Isaiah the prophet. He says, do you understand what you are reading? The first thing he does is not offer a statement, but he offers a question. He joins the man in the tension that this man is experiencing in that point in time. And those 6 words sort of crack open the whole conversation in this moment that would change this man's life forever. And the man's response is stunning. The man says this. He says, how can I unless someone guides me? Now, let me be real with you. That's not always how it's going to work. talking to the barista or to your coworker, and you're like, hey, like, how's life? And they're like, oh, if only I knew more about Jesus, then I would finally have peace. That'd be awesome if it worked that simply. It doesn't always. But I guess I'm wanting you to pay attention to the starting point. Pay attention to the starting point, and that is he started with questions. He started with interest. He started with meeting the man where he was. He started with curiosity. And why is this important? This is important because curiosity disarms what certainty cannot. Have you noticed that, like, the person who walks in the room, they're just certain about everything? They already have all the answers. They already know all the arguments. Have you noticed, like, no one wants to be that person's friend? Right? Have you noticed that it creates this like defense in the room? It creates some barriers in the room. But the person, in fact, I say this, I heard someone say this, and I say this now all the time. The smartest person in the room is not the one with all the answers. It's the person asking all the questions. It's the person who's curious. It's the person who's willing to meet people right where they are. And I think as followers of Jesus, it's so important that we understand this, to start with curiosity, to start with where people actually are. And this is hard because I think, especially if you were raised in the church, which I wasn't, but my wife Jenna was, raised in the church. That's all she really ever knew. There was this battle at times that she's had of like, well, if I'm going to share about my faith, I need to have like a full presentation ready. You know, like I need to have all the, you know, you'll know your church if I say you like memorize the Romans Road. Anybody know this? Okay, nobody. Okay, a couple of you do. So you weren't raised in church if you don't know that, but if you were in church a long time, there was like the Romans Road and all these steps, and you're there to get them to like an altar call moment where like, do you accept the Lord Jesus as your Lord and Savior? And you think if you can't do that, well then I guess I can't be effective. I guess I can't really be a witness for Jesus. Can I just please relieve you of that pressure? Just show up and be a normal human being. Just show up and meet people right where they are. And show up and be interested in them. Show up and create holy ground by seeing and hearing and knowing the person that you're talking to. Because you know what? When you just show up interested in others and you draw near to others, you are actually embodying the Christmas story. You are embodying what Jesus did. You are showing up, which is what people, I think, are looking for. Now, it doesn't mean that you never ever share about your faith. Please do. When they say, hey, how do I know unless someone tells me? Take advantage of that moment and share about what God has done in your heart and what God has done in your life. And maybe you don't know all the scriptures to quote. That's okay. Just tell them what God has done in your life. But notice that Philip didn't go there until the man gave him permission to do so. That's probably another note. Like if a person has not invited you into that space or that level of conversation, perhaps it's time to just continue to draw near, continue to meet with them where they are, and see what God does. Andy Stanley, he has a line that I think about all the time. He says, people are far less interested in your conclusions than they are in your questions. That people are far less interested in your conclusions than they are in your questions. Because questions show that you actually see the person, that you're genuinely curious where they are, not just where you want them to go. So how do we move with God who's already moving? He's already pursuing your friends, your neighbors, your enemies, your frenemies, your coworkers. He's pursuing everyone around you. How do you join God in that work? First, be available. Be available. I mean, like, what does it look like for you to maybe recreate your calendar with more margin, with more interruptibility? What does it look like for you to maybe the next time somebody calls and it's 9 at night, but this person wouldn't call unless it was significant, and I know you're tired, but you're like, you know what, I'm going to answer the call. Or that person who walks into your office and they're talking to you, and you're right in the middle of a task, but you kind of get this sense they need someone to talk to right now. What if you just closed the laptop and trusted that the world will continue spinning and the work will still get done, and you just said, okay, I'm going to be here. I'm going to engage in what could be a holy moment. You want to move where God is moving? Be available. Know that God is already there. He's already there. You don't need to be God. You just need to be faithful. And the third thing is just be interested. Be curious. Lead with curiosity, not certainty. Meet people where they are at and watch their hearts begin to open up. And here's the best part of this, is that when you do this, just like Daryl catalyzed something in my life that led me to this moment here, and he had no idea, you never know what that small interaction with somebody could do in their life. And so I want to end by reminding you not to underestimate how God can use one small act of availability. Don't underestimate what God can do in that holy space of I, thou connection with another human being. Because what we see in Acts chapter 8 is that what happens in this man's life on the road was not what Philip would have expected. The story moves fast from here. Philip is unpacking Isaiah 53, explaining that it's Jesus who died and who rose again. And finally, this man in the chariot, they pass some water, and the official out of nowhere, he says, look, here's water. What can stand in the way of me being baptized? He's like, all right, I want to follow Jesus. I want to be baptized right now. And what I love is that Philip, he doesn't hesitate. He's like, whoa. Well, let's see if your faith is legit. You need to go through a class first. No, he meets the person right where they are, and he's like, great, let's baptize you right here, right now. And then this man is baptized, and in one of the more strange moments of Acts, we're told that after the man is baptized, the Spirit of the Lord suddenly takes Philip away, which I have no idea how to explain that one, but a weird moment, and the official never sees him again. But look how this ends. It says, the text goes on, it says that the Ethiopian official, he went on his way rejoicing. Now, this matters more than you think. Not only would he go home a different man, rejoicing over the good news of Jesus that has begun to transform his life, but he would carry this message of Jesus to Ethiopia, and this would ignite one of the oldest Christian traditions on the earth, because the Ethiopian Orthodox Christian Church traces its origins back to this conversation in the middle of that road on the desert. So this man's life was not only transformed, but it would lead to an entire continent being transformed by the good news of Jesus. Think about what that means. One man, one desert road, one unscheduled conversation, one small act of availability, and a continent gets reached as a result. A new branch of Christianity was born. A 2,000-year-old faith tradition gets traced back to one person's willingness to be available. One person's willingness to join what God was already doing, and one person's willingness to meet this man right where he was. This is why I'm telling you today, don't underestimate how God can use one small act of availability. You may never know on this side of eternity. I don't even think Daryl fully knows the impact he made on my life that evening at that youth group. But you never know what God might do and how he might not only change their life, but the lives of many, many others. And so I want to end with this last thought, because I know the idea of being interruptible especially is not one that probably resonates with many of us. I doubt any of us are sitting here being like, how do I make my life more interruptible? And that's fine, but I want to argue this. I want to argue that the interruptible life is the meaningful life. That the interruptible life actually is the meaningful life. The life that moves slow enough to pay attention to the needs of others is the meaningful life. The life that moves not at the speed of hustle and hurry, but at the speed of love is the meaningful life. It's the kind of life that doesn't miss the divine moments when they're right there in front of us. Henry Nouwen, he's one of the great spiritual writers of the last centuries. He spent years, and I feel very seen by Henry Nouwen when he talked about this, he spent years being frustrated by the people who kept knocking on his office door. And he would hurry them along so he could get back to writing about loving people. He's like, I'm writing about loving people, quit interrupting me. And one day he realized the problem with that, and he wrote down this phrase that I think is really important. He says, I have come to realize that the interruptions to my work are my work. And I love that. The interruptions to my work are my work. What if we showed up on Monday with that mentality? Like, what if we actually assume, the interruptions to my work are my work, so that person who called me out of nowhere and I'm really tired, I'm not in the mood for another conversation, my kid has been screaming, bedtime was the worst, and then they call and you're like, I'm going to answer. I'm just going to see. I'm going to see what God's maybe up to here. Or the person who, they come to you and they drop sort of this, you're like, hey, how are you? And they're like, I'm not good. And you're like in the middle of eating your sandwich during lunch, you're like, oh, we're in it now. Like, what if you said in your back of your head, the interruptions to my work are my work. I'm going to pause. I'm going to pay attention. I'm going to see what maybe God is doing. I'm going to see this person. I think what we'd find out is there's holy moments happening around us all the time. The question is whether you will join God in it.